Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Criminal Minds Season 1, Episode 6, LDSK. Episode in a nutshell is a brief reminder of what happens within the episode. Alright, so in this episode, the episode opens on Hotchner trying to teach Reed or tutor Reed for his firearm qualification, which he does regrettably end up failing, which leaves him in a bit of a confidence crisis about not being armed when going against potential killers, because obviously that's their job. And Morgan doesn't necessarily make this better, as he gives him a whistle to blow should he come into any sort of trouble, as he won't have a gun for defense. However, Hotchner and Gideon tell him that he doesn't need a gun to kill somebody, to try to make him feel better, which Reed spends the episode kind of mulling over what exactly that means. The case that the team ends up on is at first thought to be a long-distance serial killer, which is what the LDSK stands for. However, as the investigation progresses, at first they stick to that theory, and they do come to the conclusion that they would have a military background because of their skill in shooting, and that most likely they would be a cop or had been a cop at one point because they knew about the shift changes and the jurisdictional lines. However, as the episode progresses, they do think one of the cops may be the suspect because he leaks the profile to the media, and the media shows up at the park where they're trying to recreate the most recent killing at that point. However, when they arrest him, he does end up being killed by the real killer, which basically, in their minds, is that the killer does not want anybody taking credit for his work. Upon further evaluation of the profile, they realize that the serial killer will want contact with the victims or the media, and since he hasn't contacted the media, he must be having contact with the victims. And that is when they start to look at other options than law enforcement for where he may be working. And they come to the conclusion that, in fact, all of the killings take place within a radius of service to two hospitals in the area. And that most likely that means that he's actually working with the patients. And at first, they think it is an arrogant surgeon that they met previously. However, upon talking with him, they do conclude that he is a raging narcissist, but not the killer. Meanwhile, Reed and Hotchner are in the ER looking for the alibi of the surgeon, and, well, that's when they ask the actual killer to go find this person. That means the actual killer, Philip, knows now that they are onto him, and so he goes into the locker room instead of finding the person they wanted to question, and gets his firearm and comes back into the ER, shots fired, and he takes Hotchner and Reed hostage, who then have to try to stay alive. Luckily, they do have their working profile, so Hotchner basically plays the villain and is extremely mean to Reed. He points out Reed is not armed because he couldn't pass his qualification, even though he went through the trouble of tutoring him, and how, he doesn't like Reed and he's hoping that the killer will kill Reed so that he doesn't have to deal with Reed anymore. Then he gets up and he actually kicks Reed in the stomach multiple times. However, Reed does pick up on his plan, which is, of course, to give Reed access to his ankle holster so that Reed can then get a firearm, which he then uses to headshot Philip, who does end up obviously deceased because good luck to surviving a headshot. And ultimately, this leads to the case coming to an end. And at the end, because Reed managed to get that headshot, he's allowed to keep the firearm, even though he does say that he was aiming for the leg, not the head. And then he also returns the whistle to Morgan, who had given him that whistle to call for help when he failed his firearms, showing an increase in confidence. So that is what happened in this episode. We'll now rank the episode. As always, we'll be ranking on our mostly objective ranking list, followed by the personal ranking list. So to start with, we have our single episode supporting characters. We have Philip Dowd, who was the LDSK / hero homicider. Then we have Dr. Barry Landman, who was the surgeon that they worked with at the hospital to retrieve a bullet at first. Then they thought he was potentially the killer or unsub, before they then realized that he was just a raging narcissist and like unpleasant person. Then we have the single episode supporting character development, and that of course is the fact that Philip was killed by Reed, which brings us to 3 points so far. Then we have our multi-season main character development, which is Reed losing his firearm qualification and having to spend the majority of this episode unarmed. And then we also have our multi-season main character growth, which of course is Reed ultimately being able to have the headshot and then returning the whistle to Morgan, gaining confidence after he manages to kill Philip, and coming to the conclusion that he doesn't need a gun to kill somebody, that, you know, the profile, like this is what Gideon had been telling him, but now he actually believes it, is Gideon telling him that he doesn't need a gun to kill someone, that the greatest weapon is a well thought out or accurate profile, going back to the footpath killer from the earlier episodes, where he notes that the footpath killer had a gun to his head, and yet he's the one who's still around because he had the profile and the footpath killer is dead. So Reed basically learns a life lesson and gains some confidence, which is growth, hence another 4 points. However, there was, of course, negatives that went along with this episode. First off is that there was negative messaging or behavior, and that's just the fact that Hotch physically assaults Reed. I mean, it's bad enough the verbal assault that he did with all of his like bad words or mean things that he said, but the physical assault is also terrible. And Reed's my favorite character, so obviously I was upset about this, so bias and judgment can still apply on the mostly objective ranking. And I mean, just objectively looking at it, beating up a colleague, even if it's for a good reason, even if it is to survive a hostage situation and appeal to the unsub in this case, just objectively, you shouldn't be beating people up. So I still think it counts for -2 points. I did want to honorably mention that I did not take out points for the weak or dislikable characters because I exclude characters meant to be disliked. And as dislikable as Dr. Barry Landman was, I think he was supposed to be disliked because that's the whole reason why they suspected him in the first place. So I do believe his dislikability was intentional, which is why I did not take points for that. However, on these episodes, because obviously there's a different killer every single time, one of the factors that I do rank on is how memorable the episode is in comparison to other episodes. And we have memorable, which is one that you would remember even outside of like the series, that'll always come back to you. Semi-memorable, which is you start to remember it as you're watching it. And then unmemorable is like, even though you've seen it before, when you go to rewatch it, it's like the first time because none of it really stuck in your brain. And unfortunately, this was one of those for me. I didn't remember who did it or where it was going the entire time I was watching. It was like it was the first time, even though I know I'd seen it before. And so that is worth -4 points. Ultimately, with all of the points calculated, it does end up leaving us with a 5 out of 10 for this episode. Which brings us now to the season 1 ranking so far in our mostly objective ranking. And in first we have Extreme Aggressor, Compulsion. This episode is in third, LDSK. Then Plain Sight, Broken Mirror, and in last place currently is Won't Get Fooled Again. So, organizing my thoughts. As far as my personal opinion of this episode, as mentioned on the objective list, this isn't an episode that's going to stick with you or mean anything. It's very unmemorable. I did find that it was engaging with the plot. Like, I didn't notice the passage of time while I was watching. I was fully engaged with what I was seeing on screen, but I wasn't necessarily entertained. And in fact, at some points, I was a little bit bored while watching this episode. I do think that there were some fun. Well, there was the whistle moment with Morgan and Reed, which I found amusing. I did think it was nice at the beginning that Hotchner was tutoring Reed. However, that was kind of overshadowed by the end where Hotchner was very mean to Reed. And I'm not an unreasonable person. I understand why Hotchner behaved the way he did, why he said the things he did. It was in line with the profile that they had given us as the audience. And of course, in order to allow Reed to get his ankle holster, he ended up kicking Reed, and he had to do it for real so that it would look real to the killer. So I understand with my logic brain why they did that. But on the emotional brain, Reed is my favorite character. So him getting beaten up was not something that I enjoyed seeing on my screen. And it's different if it was like a killer who was doing it, because, that's in line with their characterization that they are villains, they are the killers. So them beating someone up is like, okay, par for the course, that's what they'll do. But this was Hotchner, who is also a main character, who is his boss. And again, like, logic brain knows why, but emotional brain is like, I don't like this. And from that emotional perspective, again, I didn't really like the ending. I did, however, enjoy that at the end, Reed did get his confidence back. He was able to, despite failing his qualification, get that headshot that ended up resolving the issue without any further bloodshed. And then that little Morgan coming over to see if he's okay, and then him tossing the whistle before, like, strutting away. That was a great end scene as well. And overall, throughout the episode, he learns that life lesson of you don't need a gun to kill somebody, and that a strong profile is just as good of a weapon as an actual firearm, though Reed does point out that having the firearm does help. And Gideon does agree to that. So, overall, I gave it a 2 out of 10 because I really didn't like Reed getting beaten up by his boss, essentially, and by his teammate. Even if I understand why it was done, did not like it. And this is the emotional ranking, so I'm allowed to say, like, to take as many points as I want for that. But there were some other shining moments in it, so ultimately, with a 2 out of 10, that brings our season 1 ranking so far to in first, Compulsion, second, Plain Sight, third, Extreme Aggressor, fourth was LDSK, fifth, Won't Get Fooled Again, and then in sixth was Broken Mirror. So with our series rankings so far and our mostly objective ranking, season 1 is at 30 out of a possible 220, and the personal ranking for season 1 is currently at 23 out of a possible 220. With that, we've now rewatched and ranked Criminal Minds Season 1, Episode 6, LDSK. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.